in another prominent example, I'm just thinking of, because I've been covering it quite a bit recently, there was 2 Chinese agents that were actually found guilty of trying to bribe IRS agents to revoke Shenyun Performing Arts tax-exempt status, and then never mind the bomb threats and death threats and things to theaters to try to, I mean, since we're talking about the arts, right, at the Kennedy Center.
And again, the United Front activities, it really, you see the long arm of that. You see these Chinese police stations, illicit police stations in major American cities. We also see examples of how they try to infiltrate our political system. Linda Sun, who was arrested, who had been an advisor to Governor Hochul, too, and sought to curate information that the governor received, and also blocked, for example, Taiwan's representatives from having a voice there. So, Fang Fang, who targeted Eric Swalwell even before he became a congressman. So you see this targeting in order to influence, whether it's the IRS there or whether it's U.S. politicians, broad base of United Front activities.
There's another kind of dimension here that I haven't had a chance to talk about on this show, I think, which is that the Chinese have a weird view of people who are Chinese. Doesn't matter how many generations they've actually been American, even, right? If they're or especially more recent immigrants.
No, there's this saying in Chinese, 我们都是中国人. We're all Chinese. And some countries you have citizenship by the soil or citizenship by the blood. It very much is this kind of racialist idea that your identity, regardless of whether you're a citizen of another country, that you're Chinese, and therefore that the party has rights on you. And that's why, again, who is victimized by the CCP? It is primarily other Chinese. They're the targets, the dissidents who speak out, the artists like Chen Weiming, who dare to raise their voices in opposition. Someone like you talk dissidents like Rowena He, who's done so much great work, He Xiaoqing, on that idea of preservation of memory and the Tiananmen, capturing the voice of the Tiananmen generation. Communism is a totalitarian ideology. Legalism, proto-totalitarian ideology. It seeks to control the mind and what you think, and it seeks to control everyone, and that is the CCP. And I think many Americans are very naive about that. They don't understand the nature of communism. They don't understand the nature of Chinese communism, which again has these deep kind of legalist roots as well. They don't understand that distinction between rule of law and rule by law, where law is an instrument by which the emperor or the supreme ruler can control people.
You're just also reminding me, years ago I went on a sales call, actually a few sales calls with Chinese Epoch Times. For those that might not know, that Chinese Epoch Times is the most widely distributed independent Chinese language media in the world and all over. And so they would go on sales calls, I think this was in New York City. And what they figured out was, especially when they were going to like a national advertiser, they would go and say, well, we've got, 60% of the Chinese market. And so, but anybody that wanted the Chinese market, where do I sign? It's a very easy pitch, except what they figured out is this is what they'd have to say. They'd have to say, well, if you do sign this deal, someone's going to come to you, most likely, saying they somehow are affiliated with the Chinese government. And they'll say that, you're hurting the feelings of the Chinese people by working with this media, or essentially implying that you're going to be on the wrong side of the Chinese government if you do this. So you can imagine a few of those deals were lost, but they figured out if they don't tell people ahead of time that they won't get any deals, because it basically happens so often. But that was the level, and this is years ago. This was the level of interference.
Yeah. Well, you use that phrase that we hear, hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. And that's the attempt by the Chinese Communist Party to conflate the CCP with the Chinese people. And it's important that we distinguish that. The CCP is not the Chinese people. It is the political party that seeks to control the destiny of the Chinese people, and as we see with that long arm, even those that of Chinese heritage who live abroad in the United States and elsewhere. But it is not the same. And while we talk about this, the nationalism and that, there also is, I think, an undercurrent of dissent as well. And we're seeing a couple of interesting phenomena in China. Some more active dissent. We saw the white paper movement with regards to the COVID restrictions, but you also see these the bicyclists in Henan that kind of did a protest there, just tens of thousands of people on bicycles protesting. You see in Shandong where there was a road rage incident with a woman who was berating a veteran. She was alleged to be the mistress of the police chief, and all these veterans descended on this city in Shandong. There's a lot of discontent there, but the other aspect that you see, we talked about Confucianism, legalism. There's also Taoism is another way of thought in China, and any of you who've studied martial law know this Wu Wei principle, that if you have a superior force, you don't necessarily confront it because you'll get smashed, but rather you go with it and let that force dissipate. And I think what you're seeing, Xi Jinping calls for the China dream, this great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. And at the same time, he's really helped strangle the economy and create, this.
But it's not really a rejuvenation of the Chinese people, is it? Right?
It's not.
Yeah.
And the response has been to lay flat, tanping, this lay flat movement. You hear expressions like bailan, to let it rot. They talk about the garbage time of history that we've entered. That's another phrase. You have this 996 economy, working from 9 in the morning till 9 at night, 6 days a week. And some people just say, is it worth it? The other thing that you're seeing is in demographics, the Chinese people are failing to marry or opting not to marry. You also see a rise in divorces that's very alarming. And even though the CCP realized what a tremendous mistake it made in 1979 with the one-child policy and all the brutality, the forced abortion, forced sterilization that occurred in its wake, to limit its population size, it realizes that, while it's almost on the cusp of achieving hegemony there, it engineered a demographic crisis and shortfall. So they've changed the one-child policy to a two-child policy to a three-child policy, and people are just not responding. There is this societal malaise. There was a viral video a couple of years back when there was a police officer who was beating a protester and said, "You're going to be punished for 3 generations." That was that 3-generation punishment that not just the Maoists had. If your family was a landowner, that stigma attached with you, but also during the imperial period, if you were a rebel or whatever, you were punished for 3 generations. The response of this person in the video that goes, 3 generations, we're the last generation. We're not going to have children, and that I think is very, very jarring. There's a lot more brittleness right now in China, and there's this tremendous discontent with the government.
Well, and this is also in the context, or over time, the event that you attended, the 20th anniversary of the Quit the CCP movement last year. I forget now how many, but 450 odd million people have quietly quit the Chinese Communist Party over this incredible period of time. So there's all these forces.
Yeah, you have, I think, a combination. What we're seeing are these centripetal forces, Xi Jinping getting this, in the modern era, this unprecedented third term as leader of the Chinese Communist Party, but also these centrifugal forces as well. You know, that opening line in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the great works of Chinese literature, it begins by saying that the realm long divided must unite, long united must divide. Fen jiu bi he, he jiu bi fen. That concept of coming together and pulling apart is one that you see as a recurring theme in Chinese history. Just as much as there have been dynasties in China, there's also been these periods of disunity as well. And there's a lot that's going on there. And I think that, you know, Xi Jinping does feel the pressure and does feel threatened. I mean, one very important incident that occurred the year before last, and that was the death of Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang was the premier, technically he was the number 2 person in China. He died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. There's a tremendous amount of speculation that he was killed. He was found unconscious in a swimming pool. Be that as it may, and maybe we don't know for certainty, I mean, that's the perception. But why was Li Keqiang seen as a threat? Because he certainly was to Xi Jinping. Well, one was because of his views on the economy. He was critical of Xi Jinping's running of the economy and wanted to return to that period of relative prosperity that you saw during the reform era. But the other thing that he said, kind of one of his parting gifts when he left the Central Committee, or was he gave a talk, and he mentioned Ren zai gan, tian zai kan, men act and heaven watches. And that is an echo of a phrase that Mencius uses. Heaven sees with the eyes of the people and hears with the ears of the people. And it comes from an older book, the Book of Documents. But that concept is wrapped up with the idea of the mandate of heaven and the legitimacy of rulership. Mencius is asked a question, is it ever legitimate to overthrow a government and overthrow a king? And his answer is no, but it is legitimate to overthrow a tyranny and overthrow a tyrant, even kill a tyrant. And that's where that idea, well, how do you know if someone is tyrannical? Well, does he oppress the people? You know, does he offend heaven? This idea of a law above the law, this concept, the Tao or heaven, that by which you can judge the actions of rulers. It's interesting, in Western thought, St. Thomas Aquinas addresses the same question, comes up with a similar answer, that you don't disturb a government that's legitimate, but a tyranny, yes. So Li Keqiang uttered this phrase, and that was a direct challenge to Xi Jinping, and I think it was perceived as such. And again, it's something that is rooted in this Confucian tradition, too. Again, this proto-democratic, proto-human rights tradition, as opposed to sort of this legalist tyranny.
What I'm thinking to myself as we're discussing all this is, I think that deep down inside, the Chinese regime and its leadership understands that it's illegitimate. And I think the thing that it fears the most of anything is actually accountability by its own people, because of the terrible things it has done to them.
Right.
What do you think?
100%. It goes to the question of legitimacy. And we don't want to engage in regime change. That really is for the Chinese people to do. At the same time, however, we should not be subsidizing tyranny. U.S. companies that have forced labor in their supply chain, which is in violation of U.S. law, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or the Tariff Act, these companies have to be accountable for that. Or companies that partner with PLA companies. We saw it recently with cattle. The Chinese battery manufacturers, CATL, not cows. These are PLA entities. So what we should be doing is enforcing our laws there. And I think as this greater awareness, you're seeing this effort to move out of China, move your production out of China. You saw a company like Milwaukee Tool, for example, that was accused of having forced labor in its supply chain. It does its equipment manufacturing in the United States now, but it also moved, like it's for work gloves and things like that, out of China to Cambodia in response to these allegations. So you're seeing American companies disengage because they realize that there's a risk with doing business in China. I think there's more that we can do. I mean, one thing I would like to see is the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's hard to pass laws, use existing laws. The 1934 Securities Exchange Act and Rule 10b-5 that's promulgated under that concerns any statement, well, not just any statement by a publicly traded company. It prohibits material misstatements, but also material omissions. So if you're a publicly traded company and you're not disclosing the fact that your supply chains are corrupted and tainted by forced labor, then that is a potential violation of the Securities Exchange Act, because it can affect the stock price of the corporation.
At the moment, if you're a publicly traded, Chinese company through this, strange Cayman Islands instrument, right? You don't even really have to submit a meaningful audit.
Well, so there are a couple of issues there. I mean, I'm talking about American companies in particular that have corrupted supply chains, but there also is this idea of Chinese companies having access to U.S. capital markets as another area where we should draw a line. And, that's, I think, a tool that hasn't been fully utilized. We should not be rewarding these companies. But I'll give you another example. U.S. government purchases. So, Ian Urbina, who testified at a CECC hearing and had that wonderful series in the New Yorker looking at the fish supply chain. You have forced labor on these fishing boats, these Chinese fishing boats, which oftentimes double as naval militia, by the way, and we see their actions in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, there, where they oftentimes swarm Filipino vessels. So there's forced labor in the fishing, but there's also forced labor in the fish processing. You have Uyghurs and North Korean women, who's mostly women, that are basically forced to process these fish. Well, this enters the U.S. supply chain, including our procurement by our Defense Department, served on military bases, but also USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture purchases for prisons, federal prisons, and school lunch programs. So what we should be doing is, the U.S. government should be setting the example and cleansing our supply chains of products that are tainted by forced labor. So that's should be a no-brainer there. And again, it's done in violation of U.S. law.
So you're telling me that now this long storied pivot to Asia is actually happening?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a recognition that the principal challenge to the United States and hence the rest of the world really comes from the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, you see, Russia is a threat, but who supports Russia? Who is enabling the war in Ukraine to continue? And that's, I think, the support that the CCP gives to Russia. So if you want to go to the root cause of this, I think you have to focus your attention on the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Soviet Union was an existential threat, and that was recognized by most people in the United States. It was the Cold War there. The CCP now is an existential threat. What's different between that and the Soviet Union is that they have the resources that the Soviet Union never had. It still has, despite their current economic problems under Xi Jinping, they still have devoted tremendous amounts of resources to to spreading their influence and upgrading their military, building a navy. The other thing that they have in their favor that the Soviet Union never had is the use of technology, artificial intelligence, the surveillance state, the technology that the Chinese government has at its disposal, including to hack us and to gain access to sensitive data, to telephone records, is tremendous. And the Soviet Union never had that. So this is really, I think, where that threat is. And again, as like I said, it's not simply a strategic rival, it's a systemic one. It wants to rule all under heaven, Tian Sha. And literally all under heaven, including the moon, as part of their moon program as well. That was one of the reasons, I think, why President Trump created the Space Force in his first administration, and the Biden administration continued it, because it's really realizing that this is a multidimensional battlefield too, and is going to continue in the future. So I think we're going to see increasing resources and attention paid towards East Asia in particular, to counter the CCP and its influence.
And hence the vice president talking about how the Europeans need to carry more of their own weight.
Right. And I think that's true across the board. I mean, you have some that really led. The Poles, for example, have always, I think, been at the forefront of carrying their burden. You also have countries like Sweden, too, which used to, during the period of neutrality during the Cold War, they still maintained healthy defense budgets. Then, post the fall of the Berlin Wall and the peace dividend, that declined. Now Sweden, which has entered NATO, has also, I think, really sought to increase its expenditures as a percentage of GDP in the military. The NATO threshold used to be 2% of the budget. I think back in 2017, in the first year of the Trump administration, it was only 2 countries that met that threshold, and that increased to 4 the next year, and then I think it was it 8 and then 9. It dipped a little bit with the first part of the Biden presidency, but then, of course, the invasion of Ukraine, that shot up. Now what's being called for is up to 5% of GDP. Taiwan also, I think there's a call for Taiwan to increase its own defense preparedness as well, since it is on the front line. So that's something, I think, across the board, the importance of not just burden sharing, but also taking responsibility for one's own security and defense is something we'll see more of. Talking
about this idea of how the Chinese regime kind of believes it owns all Chinese, right? There's an estimate that in Silicon Valley alone, there's 25,000, basically people providing espionage support to the Chinese regime. I don't know how accurate that is, but we did talk about Chinese students, and there's several 100,000 here in America.
Right.
And all of them, the reality quite simply is, under a totalitarian regime, as we discussed, that all of them can be leveraged in various ways, right? And at some level are, even by being able to come here in the first place, right? So how do you view that reality here in America of these, hundreds of thousands of students?
Well, there have been proposals to ban Chinese students. I don't support that. I think we have to be smart about it. So if someone wants to come over to study, I don't know, advanced nuclear weapon ballistics, or generally, certain engineering fields, no, they shouldn't. I mean,
or perhaps transplant surgery.
Well, if you get to the issue of organ harvesting, which we haven't talked about, too. So yes, there should be, I think, common sense limits, but we also need to engage the Chinese people. So if people want to come and study law, or they want to study humanities, certainly it's an opportunity to dialogue and to influence that. We talk about the United Front as trying to put things in our head, as it were, and but we also, that goes two ways. And whenever you engage in dialogue and the free exchange of ideas, I mean, many of these people who come here, they're very intelligent too, and you see those that taste freedom. You see a lot of religious conversions, just anecdotally, students who encounter Christianity, for example, and who convert. And that's, I think, one of what Xi Jinping fears too, is that encounter, and that would account again for that document number 9, that real fear of ideological influence on the hearts and minds of the Chinese people. But if we are going to have, and we do, really want peace, we want the Chinese people to prosper, to enjoy the freedoms that we have too. And I think as a prerequisite to that, we always have to engage them on ideas. There are others who are open to engagement with America and American ideas, Western ideas, democratic, universal ideas. Again, and there's contribution that can be made too by an understanding of the Chinese tradition that's so rich. Confucianism has had an influence on my thought. My kind of Catholic Thomistic Aristotelian worldview is very compatible with that of Confucian thought as well.
So basically we have to be much more judicious than we have been, but also remain open. That's kind of what you're saying.
We have to have open eyes, but also open minds.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I would phrase it.
I'm very heartened to see this increase in interest in free speech in America, especially on this side of the government. Notably because I watch China so closely, and it's sort of the antithesis in China. What we have is the antithesis of that. However, the Epoch Times, we use a whole variety of technologies to help the Chinese people look at whatever they want, including the Epoch Times. Right?
Sure.
And some of them are incredibly effective. And some people have argued, and I've become convinced of this, that a relatively low-cost way of actually, helping China would be to get rid of that firewall.
Right. Well, as long as the Communist Party's there, they're going to maintain control over that, and they're going to erect firewalls. It's very interesting.
Which is basically like a censorship system. I mean, I want to make sure people understand what this is.
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
There are ways to evade it that are complicated, VPNs and the like, but they restrict the flow of information that the Chinese people can access in an effort to control what it is that they're exposed to and what opinions they can have.
Yeah.
What's very interesting is that, with the ban on TikTok, that short-lived, you had these quote-unquote TikTok refugees that went to Little Red Book, Xiaohongshu, there, and started to express their opinions freely on that. Well, the CCP noted that and then began to restrict that, because that was an avenue by which exposure to ideas that the government didn't want Chinese people exposed to, that was a channel for that. So that it became restricted as well.
But what do you think of this idea to dedicate resources to breaking that censorship system?
Breaking the Chinese firewall. I think we need to support, media. RFA and VOA, Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, their Chinese language services, Tibetan services, Uyghur news services are accessed by people within China. It's a source of information that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. So what we need is not restrictions on speech, but greater speech. We have to overcome that firewall and the censorship apparatus. That really, I think, needs to be at the forefront, because that, I think, our ideas are superior, and that is the great fear of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, Piero Tozzi, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Well, thank you, Jan. It's good to see you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all for joining Piero Tozzi and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.